Having a minor glitch. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Emor. I'm Rabbi Lev Meyerowitz-Nelson. I am the director of Emor, the Institute for Bold Jewish Thought. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's program, which is called What Do We Mean by a Jewish State?, which we're excited to be streaming live on Facebook. Emor, a project of Torah, is a new thought leadership institute where we use Jewish sources, old and new, to investigate our commitments to human rights and propel us to action. Emor is committed to bringing together people from all corners of the Jewish community to ask big questions, study Jewish texts, and hold courageous conversations about today's most important moral and political issues. As we get things started here today, I'm inviting you to share in the chat where you're joining us from and one association you have with the phrase Jewish state. Go ahead and do that if you feel moved to. Feel free to continue using the chat throughout the program to share comments or questions. In the last third or so of our time together, I'll be collecting those questions and putting them to our speaker. We sometimes get many more questions than we have time for, which I love because it means the sign of a very engaged audience. So I'll apologize in advance if we don't get to your question. Tiny bit of background before I introduce today's speaker. Back last spring, Emor convened a roundtable of 9 American and Israeli Jewish scholars to think together about a question we've been calling the threefold chord. How do democracy, nationalism, which is to say Zionism, and human rights fit together in the Jewish state in the 21st century? Many of us in the Jewish community have ideas about each of those parts of the threefold chord. We at Emor had the sense that some of those ideas had gotten stale and needed new energy. Last month, we hosted Professor Julie Cooper for part 1 of this 3-part series, sharing out some of the results of our conversations. Professor Cooper focused on nationalism and offered some thoughts about what comes after the nation state. Today, we're excited to turn to the second strand of the threefold chord and explore what we really mean when we say a Jewish state and what we might mean in the future. With that, I'm delighted to have with us as our guest teacher today, Dr. Amit Gvaryahu. Amit is a scholar of Talmud and Rabbinics. He's currently a fellow of the Martin Buber Society of Fellows at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's also taught previously at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Hadar, Drisha, Paideia, and the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. Amit, we're grateful you're here with us today. We're looking forward to a lively conversation. Take it away.
Hi everyone. Can everyone hear me? I'm a little bit of frog in my throat. Okay, I am going to do something I'm not used to doing. I am a textual scholar. I usually work with texts, and I'm veering away from that focus on textual scholarship to talk about ideas and try to parse out sort of abstract notions. And then I'd like to flesh those abstract notions out and talk a little bit about what we mean when we mean a Jewish state. When we say a Jewish state. And I'm going to share a whiteboard with you, okay, if that's all right. Does everyone see the whiteboard? Yes, awesome. We do not know who the Jews are. Okay, who are the Jews? This is a question that has been vexing observers of the Jewish collective since antiquity. We'll put aside like Pharaoh, who had ideas about who the Jews are, right there, Am B'nai Yisrael. There is a strong strand of familial closeness in our tradition. All the Jews are the children of Judah, yes, and a little bit of the children of Levi, and a few of the children of Benjamin, and they are all the children of Jacob or Israel. And so we are all a family, right? There is a strong sense of family. There is, however, also a normative tradition. Right, so there are things that Jews do and don't do. One of the pastimes of Jews has been to police other Jews on what they should be doing or not doing. We are very fond of that. That is part of our tradition. so there is a tradition of doing Jewish. Then in the Second Temple period, the notion of joining, becoming Jewish, emerged. The book of Esther has this interesting word that many of the people of the land, after the downfall of Haman, many of the people of the land, mityahadim, make themselves Jewish. Greek for that would be Judaizane, right? From where we get our Judaize. People make themselves Jewish. So you can become Jewish, apparently. That's a thing. Then there is, so there's family, there's becoming Jewish, there's a normative tradition. There is also a place whence the Jews come from. In the scholarship of the Second Temple period, it has become very sort of fashionable in the last few decades, not to speak of Jews, but to speak of Judeans. The people who live in the land of Judea are Judeans, and this is opposed to the members of the religion, right? Another loaded term that we can talk about, we'll talk about in just a minute, who are Jews, right? It is unclear whether in antiquity anybody knew that there was any kind of difference between Judeans and Jews, but we'll just put that to one side. Jews also have a language. The most popular Jewish language before the Holocaust was literally known as Jewish. Yes, or they called it Yiddish because Yid is Jew. Almost all the other Jewish languages are also called Jewish. Ladino is actually an outlier in that sense, because it is marked as the language of the Latins, yes, not as the language of the Jews. And so there's a Jewish language, and then there is a Jewish race, right? And we are all conditioned to be very, very wary of the notion that Jews are a race. We have been subjected to the racialization of Judaism, and that perpetrated the Holocaust. We carry racial stereotypes with us, right? We know to talk about our big noses and our Jewfro. There have been racial stereotypes about Jews since we know about racial stereotypes, essentially. Jews are stinky in antiquity. A popular moniker for Jewish people was garlic eaters. Okay, the Mishnah, the 2nd century compendium of Jewish law and practice, says, if someone says, I will have nothing to do with any of those garlic eaters ever again, that's a vow, a binding vow that you can't have any material benefit from any Jewish person. Okay? No garlic eaters. Jews smell funny. They eat garlic. Reconciling. Okay, now what was Theodor Herzl? Yes, when he wrote his Der Judenstaat in the mid 19th century, what was going through his head when he was talking about the Jewish state? Yes. And what was going through the head of Berborchov, the socialist Zionist thinker, and what was going through the head of Abraham Isaac Kook, the religious Zionist philosopher, rabbi, right? Every person of the relatively small, relatively homogenous milieu of thinkers who had ideas about this Jewish state and promoted the notion of a Jewish state, was actually working on a different definition of who the Jews were and what was different about them and what their problems were. Yes. And bringing that all together into the context of a modern nation state, we get these clashes because nobody thought it out to begin with, right? So until someone had to figure it out on the ground in every given case, people recognized Jews like they recognized pornography, right? They knew one when they saw one. There were border cases. There were people who were of Jewish and non-Jewish ancestry. There were people who were born Jewish but did not act Jewish. There were people who acted Jewish but were not born Jewish. That was all well and good because there was no state bureaucratic apparatus, right, that needed to make choices about a public sphere, about rules to run hospitals, about what exactly would run or not on Saturday. Yes, and I'm saying Saturday on purpose because Shabbat is, right, it's a loaded term by itself. The decision-making process of the modern nation state is what makes us have to confront what really Jewish people have been very good at not confronting at all. Okay, we really didn't want to have to confront the question of what exactly Jews are, who exactly makes them Jewish. It has always been messy around the edges. There has been no real utility in answering the question. And suddenly, a nation state needs to keep people in, it needs to keep people out, it needs to make choices about a public sphere. And so we need to decide what are the Jews and what part of the Jews deserves the nation state. Now, all of this question in like everyday discourse, if you read Haaretz every day, if you read the op-ed pages of the New York Times, if you are in the habit of having conversations about Israel with your friends, I am assuming a sort of center left bent to most of the people here. If that's not you, you can raise your hand in the chat and we can talk about that. But left of center Jewish people have been working for many years with this idea that the Jewish state needs a Jewish majority in order to maintain its Jewishness. And that sentence is completely unintelligible to me, because if you don't know what Jews are, then what exactly is this majority going to do? How are they going to do it? And what utility is there in bringing all these people together just for the sake of having a state with no content? Now, let's assume for a minute, okay, that we don't want a supremacist, right, exclusionary, supremacist, racist, and oppressive of outsiders Jewish state. Let's put that to one side. The beginnings. This has been playing out for a while. The rhetoric of Jewish state has worked very nicely for the people who intend to be exclusionary, racist, and oppressive of outsiders. And the reason it's been so successful is that it relies on a heady cocktail of some aspects of the Jewish family. Wait, no, some aspects of the family. Yes, I want to draw. Please let me draw. Some aspects of family. Okay, some aspects of normative tradition, an erasure of becoming Jewish. Okay, not a strong association with place, not a strong association with language. Race is iffy. I don't know. I have to give more thought to the question of the Jewish supremacists and the Jewish race. It's very interesting. But there is a strong connection between family and normative tradition. And just in a nutshell, right, the bad narrative that we're trying to avoid here is all Jews are brothers. All Jews are brothers, and in their brotherhood, they obey the normative tradition. Whether or not they obey the normative tradition in their homes, the normative tradition must be obeyed in the public sphere. And the aspects of the normative tradition which we choose to obey in the public sphere are the ones which reinforce the notion of family. Okay, the exclusionary aspects, the ones that make outsiders feel bad. Just for example, hospitals in Israel on Passover will not let you bring any food in to the precinct. This was brought before the court, the Supreme Court. One of the reasons the ultra-Orthodox parties are very happy that the court's wings are going to be clipped is that the Supreme Court essentially said you can't tell people not to bring food into a hospital ever because of religious considerations. That part of the normative tradition is upheld and obeyed because Passover is very important to Jewish people, right? Not seeing any kind of chametz on Passover is an important aspect of the Jewish normative tradition. The people who are diligent about observing the commandments are into that. The people who are less diligent about observing the commandments know about it and respect it. Now think about a prohibition that is actually just as severe in the rabbinic normative tradition as seeing leaven on Passover. Not eating. Eating leaven is actually really bad, but seeing leaven on Passover is a negative commandment. It's like eating pork. Okay, and it is also, hold on to your hats, it's like lending it interest. Lending it interest is a biblical prohibition. It is in fact 5 biblical prohibitions. All the banks in Israel lend at interest. They have a document that is signed by a bunch of rabbis in an authorized formula that's sort of like a blank check that allows them to lend at interest. More stringent rabbinical authorities actually say this doesn't work. Not only do banks lend at interest, people lend at interest to each other. Observant ultra-Orthodox Jews lend at interest to each other, again, relying in part on this permission to lend at interest, this fictitious permission to lend at interest. Nobody ever says it is not a Jewish normative tradition that, you know, in the public sphere we should not have interest on our loans, right? You can't advertise cake on Passover, but you can advertise interest-bearing loans and credit cards any day of the year, right? Nobody says it's disrespectful to the Jewish tradition to advertise credit, right? Perfectly fine to advertise credit. Think about another aspect of the Jewish tradition, right? The Sabbath. On Shabbat, many stores in Israel are closed. Many people do not work. The public sphere is rather silent on Shabbat. But that does not mean that there are no people doing work. Many people are doing work on Shabbat. Not only people in hospitals, but people in synagogues, people in catering halls, right? There is a whole market of Shabbat work happening in Israel, which may or may not be kosher according to the laws of Shabbat. The public sphere looks like there is nothing going on, but in other areas, there is work happening. okay? The laws of Shabbat do not differentiate between these two things, but the connection between the family and the normative tradition does. So there is a picky and choosy aspect about what parts of the normative tradition are accepted and what parts are not. Now, the part of the normative tradition that is upheld very strongly is the prohibition on intermarriage. You may or may not know the organized Jewish community has always had a problem with intermarriage. The marriage of people who are Jewish to people who are not Jewish. It is slightly lesser known that in Israel, it is in fact impossible to legally intermarry. Both bride and groom need to be members of the same religion in order to marry each other according to Israeli law. There is a large loophole, which the state has generously provided, which is that any marriage contracted outside of the state of Israel is valid and is registered as a marriage according to a public document procured to the Ministry of the Interior. But the legal status is nobody can marry outside their faith. Nobody can marry outside their religious group. And what that means, and now that's coupled with the fact that it is very hard to become Jewish in Israel. Okay? And again, this ties into the family aspect. People who are already Israeli citizens and are not Jewish have an easier time becoming Jewish because they are family members of Jewish people. People who are Arab cannot become Jewish. Okay, it is just not authorized by the committees in charge of authorizing conversions. There are committees that authorize conversions. It is not enough to observe the normative tradition. Okay, you need to be part of the family. It is not enough to be part of the family. You need to observe those parts of the normative tradition that reinforce the family. So I'd like to break out of that, and I'd like to think about alternative models. And the rest of the time I think that's what, 7 minutes, I'd like to propose to think about a few other models that we can think about. We could have had a self-identification as Jewish and let anyone affiliate with the Jewish ethnic group. That was the legal situation in Israel until 1953. The Ministry of the Interior just accepted people's good faith declarations that they were Jewish. And then what you would have, okay, what that did, the good faith declaration, was bring all of these factors together, right? I was not born Jewish, but I live in the Jewish land and I speak the Jewish language and I have decided to make myself Jewish. I was born Jewish, but I hate the normative tradition. I don't look anything like you. I don't speak your language. I live here, speak your language, look like you, observe your normative tradition, but I have absolutely no connection to you or your family. And I have no intention to undergo a rite of passage. Right? We can also start lopping off other groups of factors. The most interesting experiment was a book published by David Ben-Gurion and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi in the 30s called Leverur Motza HaFalachi, which roughly translates to understand the extraction or heritage of the Felahim, the Palestinian peasants. And they sold this idea, which they then never followed up on. And in fact, Ben-Gurion became one of the chief architects of the Nakba, that the Palestinian farmers, as opposed to the Bedouin, were part of the family. They were ethnic Jews. They had They were the descendants of the Judeans. They had converted to Christianity when that was in style. They converted to Islam when that was in style, and they hadn't gone anywhere. They did not move. They were connected to the place, right? And they were members of the family. If you play out the implications of that, right, that essentially means the Jewish state consists of all the Palestinians. Anyone who claims a connection to the land of Israel, okay, is an ethnic Jew. And now there is the work of integrating the heritage and the language and the customs and the religion, just right, play it out, of these Jews, whose heritage and customs and language and tradition are no less authentic than, you know, the Jews in Europe or the Jews in North Africa, right? This is a non-diasporic Jewish community which has chosen to adopt a different normative tradition and a different language, but has retained its aspects of family and place. Also, by the way, this is the 30s, they probably also retained the aspects of race. Another aspect, another sort of way that we can think about this is becoming Jewish and the normative tradition. If the Jewish state has a Jewish public sphere, does that mean that Jews need to get extra rights? No. Right? Does that mean that there is any notion of family involved? Not necessarily. You could imagine a Jewish state that says, we do not discriminate on the basis of religion. We are a modern Western democracy. We actually don't care about your religion at all. However, the civil law of the Jewish state will be based on rabbinic halakha, on the Jewish legal tradition. And the criminal law of the Jewish state will be based on the Jewish legal tradition. And we will have a council of elders that will rule regarding all of these matters. And that is the Jewishness of our state. This notion of a Jewish state does not solve any of the actual problems that it was meant to solve, right? The people suffering racism and oppression and microaggressions in Western and Eastern Europe were not looking for that. But if you want a unique cultural expression for a group of people, maybe that is the least oppressive. Another interesting option that we could think of is having an established church, which this is more or less what the chief rabbinate of Palestine could have been. It was not, and what the chief rabbinate of Israel also could have been, and it was not that either. Think of England, right? In England, the queen or the king is the head of the Church of England. The ecclesiastical hierarchy is paid by the government. There are bishops in the House of Lords. Rules that in Jewish communities get decided by, you know, boards of rabbis and synagogue boards, and, you know, communities splitting up and hating on each other, get decided by acts of parliament. So when the Church of England was compelled by parliament to ordain bishops who identified as women, one of the provisions of the law was that all the bishops consecrated would be women until gender parity was reached in the Conference of Bishops. This is not a religious choice made by a synod of, you know, clerics. This is a law passed by parliament, because parliament is acting for the head of state, who is the head of the church. We could have envisioned that kind of Jewish state. And then a lot of the politics around Jewish practice would have devolved into the bureaucratic machinations of the chief rabbinate of Israel. Again, not an exciting outcome, but an interesting outcome, and a way to maintain the Jewish character of the state without a Jewish majority, without the oppressive tools required, right, to maintain this majority, without keeping people out, right? And so what I want to sort of finish with and open the floor up for questions here is, when people say, right, and when we are tasked with saying, defending the notion, which is likely undefensible, but if we're trying to do it, defending the notion of a nation state that is in its character Jewish, we should not be tempted to fall into the trap of assuming that we know what Jewish means. And there are many ways to maintain a Jewish cultural / religious / ethnic character of the Jewish state without it devolving into I'm looking for the proper term, garbage fire that it is currently turning into. I think that's what I have to say, and now I'm happy to talk a bit.
Great, thanks so much. And if you're done with the whiteboard, maybe we can get rid of that so we can see each other better. I want to start with a question about, there's a question in the chat about what might be a kind of minimum acceptable definition of a Jewish state. I want to go also to the law of return, which I recognize is not in your area of academic expertise, but since you're the one on the hot seat, is there some kind of, or could there be some kind of minimum definition of a Jewish state that different parties could agree upon? And is there a place in there for law of return as a kind of safety escape valve for Jews fleeing persecution in other parts of the world?
The law of return is not for Jews fleeing persecution in other parts of the world, right? The law of return is not an emergency stopgap. The law of return, I'm turning off self-view because I'm feeling self-conscious. Thank you, hide self-view. Oh, no, you won't let me hide self-view. I just have to see a big picture of myself. Sorry about that, guys. The law of return is not that. The law of return is a blanket measure that says, Kol Yehudi zakai la'alot liYisrael. Any Jew is eligible to make aliyah to Israel. The law of return may be amended one day to cover cases of persecution. The law of return could probably also be expanded to include descendants of Palestinians, right, who were displaced from their land by the Nakba. Let's put that aside for a minute, because persecution and restoration to your land, that's a whole other story. The Jewish state should respond to persecution. Yes, persecuted Jews, very bad in the Jewish tradition. I think everyone can agree on that. Persecuted other people, also pretty bad in the Jewish tradition. Most honest Jews can agree about that as well. Let's put that aside. What is a minimum acceptable definition of a Jewish state? I don't think there is a minimum acceptable definition that everyone can agree on. Aside from, and maybe not even, aside from self-defining, right? If you have, and that's how we got to where we are today. There was an influx, right? There were a lot of Jewish displaced people in Europe. They needed somewhere to go. They obviously knew they were Jewish. They didn't have the resources or the time or the headspace to think about what exactly made them Jewish. The problem was, right, that is not a sustainable model, right, for going forward, unless you adopt the model wholeheartedly. Unless you say, right, everyone who was here, we love you all, you are equal citizens, and now let's go forward with that. Right? And that's not what happened. What happened was that there was a creation of a racialized system of additional rights for Jewish people, and dispossession and displacement for Palestinian people, and then the treading the line between Jewish and not Jewish became very, very complex, because there is a whole set of rights and privileges that accrue to the Jewish citizens of the Jewish state. Right? So if you want a minimum acceptable definition, how about we go for acceptable in the moral sense? I think a state where the national language is a Jewish language, okay, that could be definitely called a Jewish state. A state that follows the Jewish calendar, also, like in its bank holidays, you could go for Jewish state for that. Yeah, that's and in my book, minimum acceptable definition.
Great, thanks. When you were sketching out the current state of affairs and the different poles of identity that have been drawn on, you said a weak reliance on place, or a weak relationship to place. And there's a question about that, why you call it weak, given the, and here I'm interpreting the question, given both the Rabbanut's existence in a nation state and the nation state corresponding to a certain geography. So why a weak relationship to place?
So the nation state does not respond to a certain geography, right? The nation state, the Israeli nation state exists within certain borders, and then in a porous area around it, there are people and communities who carry with them the sovereignty of the Jewish state, right? And what I mean is, there is Israel, and then there's the West Bank and Gaza, and the settlers who walk around in the West Bank and Gaza as if they are in Israel, right? The status of an Israeli citizen in the West Bank is not like the status of an Israeli citizen in Italy. Israeli citizen in the West Bank can call the Israeli police, pays Israeli taxes as if they live in Israel. They can vote. You can't vote outside of Israel, but you can vote in the West Bank. They can be conscripted to military service. It's Israel, except it's not really Israel. So that's the first sense of weakness of place. The second sense of weakness of place is people who are intimately associated with the place, right, do not get any privileges in the Jewish state. Right, so there is a kind of professed fealty and love for the land of Israel, but the people whose families have been living in the land of Israel since time immemorial, they don't count. They're not native. They're outsiders. And there's a rabbinic tradition about Esau, Isaac's son, yes, Esav, who stayed with Isaac while Jacob ran away. Esau merited all sorts of benefits. The entire existence of the Roman Empire was chalked up to the fact that Esau stayed with his father, whereas Jacob ran away. And this is a reflection of the rabbinic understanding that while the Judeans were exiled to Babylonia, the Idumeans, who lived very close by, went nowhere and were actually much more native than they were. And that reflects a kind of discomfort and a kind of sort of negotiation with this idea that there were people who were ethnically and linguistically very related to the Jews who did not go anywhere. And maybe they belong here more than we do. And so there's what could have happened was that there would have been, we can still do this, yes? We could embrace the people who are intimately associated with the place, yes, as members of the collective, call it what you will, the national collective covered by the Jewish nation state, right? Say, these two are Jews. They call themselves Palestinians. Yes, that's fine. That's their word for it. They practice Islam. That's also fine. They speak Arabic. Yes, but genetically and ethnically and geographically, they are just as Jewish as anyone like me, whose grandfather came from the Ukraine. And they are our brethren, right? They're our long lost brethren. Now we have, now instead of that, we have missions to bring the lost tribes of Israel home from India and the Andes, which is not bad. Yes, if people identify as Jews, they should definitely live out that identification as they see fit. But there is an interesting disconnect between the ability to integrate groups which until recently did not identify as part of the Jewish collective, and the unwillingness to extend the privileges of full belonging to the Palestinians who fully belonged until someone came along and told them they did.
Really fascinating, that tension between the treatment of the people who are right there in the land versus treatment of these far-flung populations around the world. And I also love what you brought up about Esau and the kind of filial loyalty. I always feel like he gets the short end of the stick in our interpretations.
What's important to remember about Esau, I'll just asterisk that for a minute. Esau is the Roman Empire. Esau is the government calling the shots for the Jews. The Jews in antiquity definitely felt that Esau was winning. And their reason for it was Esau was more rooted in the land than we were. Okay, Romans belong here more. They didn't read the Romans as somehow invading. The Romans were actually just as native to this land as Jews were.
Wow. I want to go to a different direction. One of the comments early on as you were speaking in the chat was that the idea of a Jewish state was a failure to acknowledge Zionism as envisioned by Buber, to be an intercultural state where Jews might find refuge and a place to rebuild their culture, not to the exclusion of all others. So what's the point where Judaism, where the concept of a Jewish state becomes this exclusionary force as opposed to the more open one that could have been envisioned?
I am not a historian of 1948, but my guess is then, right? The partition plan is based on the notion that you have ethnically homogeneous political units. And then when there is a fight for borders, what you're trying to do is get the most ethnical homogeneity within the largest possible borders. That's the game, right? And the minute you have that, you need to answer all the other questions. Could Buber's vision have worked? I don't know, probably not. Definitely not in the sort of the adversarial state that Jews and Arabs found themselves in Palestine in 1948. But again, there was not enough work being done to create a sense of belonging and camaraderie between these two populations. And yes, the settler colonialist aspect of it did not help.
I've got several other questions here that I think are probably also outside your area of expertise. So I'm trying to steer for the ones that I think you'll have a better shot of speaking about. Early on, we were talking about defining what is a Jew. Someone commented that before the state, Zionist reformers, Bundists were defining themselves partly on their answer to the question of what a Jew is. So is there like a diasporist definition of Jew that's different from the Zionist rooted in the land definition of a Jew?
So the Zionists are not rooted in the land. I think that's right. That's the important thing to remember. Zionists want to be rooted in the land. Right? It's an aspiration to be rooted in a land, to finally end the abnormal situation, right? The curse of diaspora on Jews, right? And in that sense, the Zionists were the most traditional of all of the sort of revolutionary groups that arose in the Jewish community in the 19th century, because they're the ones who actually fully bought the notion that Jews did not belong where they lived, but they belonged somewhere else, right? Which I think for American Jews, that is really hard to understand. And if anyone said it, right, when Trump says you're prime minister to American Jews, we get offended. Correctly, justly offended. And the notion that we don't belong where we live, right, is borderline anti-Semitic when not said by Jews. Okay, that is the bedrock of being a Zionist. Jews don't belong where they live, they belong at home. Their home is the land of Israel, where other people live at the moment. Okay, and Achad Ha'am, when he writes his essay, Emet Me'eretz Yisrael, that's the first thing he says. He's like, guys, you're saying it's empty, but it's not empty. It's full of people, and they're pretty happy. They're doing pretty well. They don't want you here. And that's why Achad Ha'am tried to sell the notion of, let's just have a cultural center in Jerusalem. We'll have, like, I don't know, Rome, a place where there already is a large Jewish population. We'll bring more Jewish intellectuals and thinkers. We can set up a campus, maybe on Mount Scopus, and we can hang out there, and that'll be our cultural center, but it won't be a nation state. That, again, failed dismally. And it didn't fail for bad reasons. It failed because there were displaced persons who needed to be placed. Yes, and that was the solution. But the solution caused a whole set of other problems.
Is there a way for there to be a Jewish state that that isn't strictly governed by halakha?
So halakha, there is a way for there to be a Jewish state without any connection to the Jewish normative tradition at all. And there is a way for there to be a Jewish state with a very strong connection to the Jewish normative tradition, that is also, right, that also includes the Western democratic liberal tradition inside of it. Halakha is, as I've learned from many of my teachers over the years, halakha is a language with which to express values. It is not a set of rules, and it is not a priori exclusionary. It's just a language with which to express values. I think if the Jewish state took it upon itself, right, to express its values couched in the language of halakha, that would be great. That would be a very culturally inclusive manifestation of what a Jewish state could be.
Early in your presentation, you were giving the examples of legislation about chametz in hospitals on Pesach versus the way the laws around lending with interest have gotten sort of thrust to the side. Is there any non-cynical reading of why this rule is getting lifted up heavily and the other rule is quietly swept away?
The rule on interest was quietly swept away in the 16th century. Jews have been lending at interest to each other unproblematically, signing various boilerplate documents for hundreds of years now. Jews have also been eating bread on Passover for hundreds of years now. And Jews have been visiting hospitals with bread on Passover for hundreds of years, since the invention of, the hospital. There is not a realization that the interest laws are part of a public sphere that makes people feel uncomfortable in the same way that chametz on Passover makes people feel uncomfortable. There's a visceral reaction that Jewish people have, many Jewish people have to chametz on Passover, that they just don't have to credit cards. And that's fine, right? That is an integral part of the Jewish normative tradition. It's just not a necessary part of what a public sphere should look like in the Jewish state, right? Saying it's a Jewish state is not enough, because if all it does is justify a certain gut feeling, okay? And left of center people say things like, it's a Jewish state, we should not be deporting refugees. Yes, that's true, right? It's a Jewish state, we should make sure everyone gets equitable education. It's a Jewish state, we should get decent labor laws for everyone. Yes, but it's not anchored in any kind of claim other than, in my gut, this feels not Jewish. That's not strong enough. It's not strong enough anywhere. Some parties have more raw power to push it through than others, but it's not the right way to do things.
Great. I love this next question, and it might be our last, depending on timing. Question is, can there be a Jewish state that has absolutely no connection to Jews in the diaspora? That is to say, where diaspora Jews could be entirely free of an association, or are we diaspora Jews forced into this association with the Jewish state?
That's the pickle, right? That's the pickle.
The garlicky pickle?
Yes. Because the Zionist movement is a diasporic movement of people from all over the Jewish world who came together. The joke apparently was in the early 20th century that a Zionist is a Jew who gives money to another Jew to send a third Jew to Palestine. That's what Zionism is. Zionism is the claim that all the Jews in the world are an ethnic unit. And as an ethnic unit, they're deserving of a nation state. That is not the only model we can think of. We can adopt, I think, a more nuanced model based on how Jewish communities treat each other, or treated each other in the pre-modern world. Jews had connections with each other, definitely. They had associations with each other across large geographic distances, but there is no large organization or hierarchy within Jewish communities, and each Jewish community treats itself legally, normatively, in matters of right, RITES, in matters of like prayer and liturgy, as an independent unit. If you look at the prayer for the community, the Aramaic prayer for the community that is found in the traditional Siddur after Torah reading on Shabbat, you will see that the prayer is for all of this holy community, the men and the women and the children. That's it. Parish churches pray for their bishop, and they pray for the head of the diocese, and they pray for the Pope. We don't have that. The closest we have is a prayer for like the rabbis in Babylonia, but that is likely a Babylonian prayer of Babylonian Jews. There is no hierarchy, and so we can think of having a local Jewish community that is organized in a state, and then other local Jewish communities that are not organized in a state, that are, voluntary organizations in a Christian Western democracy. We could think of that, except that the model of a diaspora community especially in America, a diaspora community with associations with the parent country. Think of the Irish Americans and the Italian Americans. The Jewish Americans, I think, just fell into the mold of then, it's not a parent country, it's a child country. But that's the kind of connection that's envisioned. Would I want to see the Jewish community or the Jewish state Israel understand that it should not be associated with the Jewish communities outside of it on a bureaucratic and institutional level? I don't know. That would require like a lot of thinking, again, about the basic question of what it means to be Jewish and what are you doing here? But I think if Israel, the more Israel goes along the paths of trying to be equitable and just to all the people who live in Israel, it will look less and less like another Jewish community. And by force, I think it would be just more different, right? It would not be sort of commensurate. I was at a synagogue once, I'll finish with this. I was at a synagogue once somewhere in New York State, and the rabbi was talking about something that happened in Israel, and the word citizen slipped his mind for a minute, and he's like, I don't live in Israel, I'm not a member. That was the word that came out for belonging in the state of Israel. And it was sort of uncanny that the word he used was, the one you use for the people who pay dues to the gym, or the people who have, certain privileges at the country club, or the people who, can get an aliyah at the shul. States don't have members. States have citizens. If you have members, you have a wrong idea of what a nation state should be. And I think there's something there.
Wonderful. We're going to leave it there because we're out of time. I want to really thank you so much, Dr. Amit Gvaryahu, for taking the time to share your expertise with us, for stretching beyond your expertise where we asked those questions. For everyone, if you like today's program, you'll want to register for part 3 of our series, where we get to democracy. Dr. Yali Hashash, another participant from last spring's roundtable, will be speaking about how white Christian influence is reshaping Israel. That's happening Thursday, February 16th at noon Eastern Time, 9 a.m. Pacific. Those details and the registration link will be in your inbox probably before Shabbat tomorrow. I really want to thank as well the Trua and Emor staff who made today's program possible. That includes Shira Danan, Bennett Decker, and Rabbi Becky J. Finally, thanks to all of you for being here and being part of the conversation. At Emor, we believe that words create worlds. I look forward to many more conversations where we together create the world we want to live in. Thanks so much. Have a good rest of your day.